Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name's Jodie and I work in the communications team at Moors for the Future Partnership, and today I'm joined by Chris Fry, who is our Conservation Quality Manager. These webcasts are taking place instead of the Bogtastic events that we'd normally be attending at this time of year, and are part of the More Life 2020 project, which is funded by the EU Life programme, Severn Trent, Yorkshire Water and United Utilities. We hope you enjoy joining Chris today as he shares some of the fascinating aspects of his job. We'll be aiming for Chris and I to be chatting for about 20 minutes and then about 10 minutes of questions at the end. If you've got any questions at any point in the presentation, just type them into the chat bar on the right hand side of your screen and we'll answer these towards the end. Please also feel free to comment in the same panel as we go along. We've got a couple of quizzes for you today, as well as a few materials for you to download, which will pop up during the course of the webcast. So please do get involved. If you have any issues with the sound or video at any point, try refreshing your screen, and if you still have difficulties, do again let us know in the chat bar and we'll see what we can do. So hello Chris.
Hello, how you doing?
Good, thanks. To kick us off today, we've got a quick quiz. So Chris, can you explain what this quiz is, and people can have a look at and choose one of the answers, please?
Sure. It's a starter question. It sort of underlines what we're here for. It's what percentage of blanket bog in England is in favourable condition? Is it?
Okay.
We've got 4 possible answers here. Is it 5, 12, 28, or 66%?
Okay, so we've got a few answers coming in.
We do.
Just wait for a few more. So, okay, so the most people, 57% of people have said 4 answers. Sorry, have said 5%. And some people have said 12%, and one person has said 28%. So can you reveal the answer, please?
The answer is 12%. So some people are even less optimistic than pessimistic. But yeah, 12%. So I mean, the bottom line of that is that about 9/10 of our blanket bog isn't good enough. It is the way that I see it. So we have got quite a lot of work to do. This is one of our super soil peat, and 90% of it isn't really doing what it should be doing. So that's the driving force behind my work, More for the Future, is it should be doing so much for us, and right now it isn't.
Lovely, thank you. So your job is all about returning blanket bog to favourable condition. So can you explain a bit about your role and what you're tasked to do, please?
Sure. So More for the Future is entirely project funded. That means organisations or authorities give us money to achieve a certain bunch of tasks within an amount of time. So I spent 5 or 6 years at More for the Future as a project manager, where your responsibility is to manage all 3 of those things: the time, the budget and the quality. That's a heck of a lot of detail to deal with. So my role was created to focus on the quality. So we still have our project managers, but my role is not to focus on the timescales, not to focus on the budgets, not the tenders, not the legal details. I want to get the long-term good solutions on the hill that we can look back on in 20, 30 years' time and say, oh, that was a good job, wasn't it? Not worrying about whether the project was managed well, whether the update reports were on time, but whether the work on the hill is a good long-term solution that's addressing our modern needs, if you like. Yeah. So
how do you do that?
Well, I mean, it's partly. I think we're looking for these. Trials are part of it. But at the moment, we have imperfect evidence. We don't know everything we want to know about these moors, but we know we have a critical situation that we have to resolve, and so we're having to make decisions. We've got 13 conservation works officers who are working on last year with 39 sites, this year 40 different sites, and I would suggest that each one of them is working on problems I would say are beyond the current peer-reviewed evidence. So in each of those sites, we are having to work out what to do, and it hasn't exactly been done before, because every site is different. And so with each of those sites, with each of those many techniques are involved in one site, I'm working with each of those works officers to look at the evidence that there is, and where there isn't clear evidence, we try to find some. So we do trials, for example, looking at sphagnum, looking into the pipes in dams, or inquiring into peat pipes, or how to re-wet the moors with bunds and things like that, or with the sphagnum choice that we use. So it's all about trying to find brand new solutions, really, because these days we're asking of these moorlands to deliver carbon, deliver water quality, to deliver flood storage, biodiversity, recreation, healthy thriving communities, and sustainable economy. All those things. We've never actually looked at these hills and wanted all those things at the same time from them at the same time. And so we've got a brand new set of desires, and so we've got to think of a brand new set of solutions. Some may
So there's no textbook
correct.
for you to just open and
That's right.
and get the techniques from.
That's right. There are old techniques which are good, but we have to find a new way of using many of them. And so it's about creating a new solution to a new problem, if you like.
And each moor is an individual moor with different needs, different situation.
Very, very, very much. Each moor has its own biological and geological conditions, and its own bunch of stakeholders. So the landowners, the tenants, the people who use it, each site we have to do two surveys. We have to survey the land, and we have to survey the people to find out what the people are prepared to go with, because we are always working on somebody else's land with somebody else's money, with a group of stakeholders who have interest and long-term family interest and all sorts of things in that land. And so we can't just up and tell people what to do. We have to work with a group of people, working at what the collective outcomes are, what everyone needs from the project, what we can't do, and finding a solution that fits to that particular shaped hole. You could argue, as I say, about square pegs and round holes. We find every hole is a different shape, and we have to carve each peg, you could say.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a few topics that we want to talk about today. And one of the issues that you've been kind of having to smooth out is the issue of protecting our cultural heritage on the moors.
It is.
So can you explain about those issues and what you've had to do about it?
I mean, this is a picture of a Linlow man, a chap who died quite some time ago, and his body was preserved in the peat. The same qualities that make peat good for us, the anaerobic conditions, which mean that the vegetation doesn't rot down so much, also preserve things like this. And so we are working on a very iconic landscape. It's a very valuable landscape with human and biological interests, but it's also a knackered and damaged one too in many places. And so we have a really tricky deal of trying to restore the issues while maintaining the current values of those sites. And often they are on the same piece of ground. And so when we are tasked with restoring the water, restoring the carbon issues, restoring the biodiversity, we have to consider there are other things there too. Just as I mentioned, the people and for example, the grazing that's going on, we have to factor in those sorts of things. We have to factor in what's beneath the ground as well. And so there are different ways of doing, well, in part, it's about there are records, and so we can always identify the historic records on a site, and we can earmark those, and we can ring fence them if you like, and work around those. But unfortunately, where there is potential archaeology or close to archaeology, there is a grey area. And critically, what I see is a dismembered responsibilities about this landscape that we work on. So if you look at the work that we do, where it's largely environmentally funded, that comes to death for a lot of the time. Whereas the historic record is managed by the digital media and sports department. So those two different departments manage those two issues on the same landscape. And it seems to me that projects never have that holistic view of the landscape. So while we may be wanting to do work on the land to protect the water and everything else, no one's paying us to resolve the archaeological issues, which are there. And
so how have you gone about kind of sorting that out and making sure that everything gets looked after?
Basically, we talk to people. We consult the records. We make sure that where there is clear evidence, we abide by that. We do not want to go destroying important archaeology. But where there are these grey areas, we talk to the archaeologists. So with some of our techniques, for example, if the archaeologists aren't familiar with them, brash spreading, for example, the heather brash, the chopped up heather that we spread over bare peat to try to create a microclimate that allows vegetation to grow. That's a critical step with the bare peat restoration. There's been some concern, what might it do to the archaeology? Actually, that's not much, because you're spreading brash on the surface that will have to help to keep the peat in place.
And it might well actually help preserve the archaeology.
And to explain those differences can alleviate some of the risks or the worries in people's mind. Similarly, talking about peat dams, for example, where you do have to excavate in the peat. But if you look at the three-dimensional view of the landscape, often the archaeology is these wonderful finds you get where someone right at the end of the glaciation period was sat on their bottom, cracking flints around the place, little scattering, and you let the bottom print left on a kidney-shaped bottom print on the ground from thousands of years ago, which sounds astronomical. It's amazing. But that's right at the interface of the peat and the mineral, and we don't want to work there. When we're doing peat dams, we want the consolidated peat in the middle, so we don't want to go that deep. And also there's stuff at the surface that we can see, we can identify that. So by talking about the landscape in a three-dimensional detail, we can work out where the actual risks are, and we can alleviate fears, and we can work more closely with the archaeologists. So when we are in effect put at loggerheads by, I would say, it's slightly imperfect funding schemes, we talk about the detail. We have to work through it, and working with people seems to be the best way to do that, because arguments just cause a clash, and then everyone loses their money and time fighting each other, and they don't get work done.
Great, thank you. We're going to move topic now, and we're going to talk about sphagnum a bit, everyone's favourite topic, because another of your kind of recent bits of interesting work, I think, has been around trying to get the right sphagnum in the right place, and that might have caused delays to projects, but ultimately it's given a kind of given us better quality in our work. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's the example of where my role differs from the project managers, because they have their clear timescales for getting money spent, getting orders put in, that sort of thing. And one of the things that we've been developing is our sphagnum pool mix to put in the particularly wet parts of these sites that we're restoring, for example, behind peat dams. And as the conservation quality manager, my role is to ensure we're getting the best. So I don't mind if we push those timescales a bit. Project managers would like it to be tick, 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 all nice and even. My role is to make sure we go for the best quality. And so there's a very interesting bunch of conversations occurred recently. And so I have to thank the people like John Riley, Richard Lindsay, Neil and Barbara Wright, Tim Tom, Alistair Lockett, and many others for some conversations that happened very recently about sphagnum and the way that the growing conditions on our moors aren't necessarily reflecting what they used to be in the past when they were in better condition. That fantastic conversation has helped us to refine our sphagnum pool mix so that we now have 3 different types of sphagnum plug. I think my colleagues Tia has talked about why we use plugs rather than translocated sphagnum, for example. But the plugs that we use, we have 3 different types now. So we have what we call the moorland mix, a chunky mix, and a pool mix.
So each of those plugs has got a mixture of different species.
That's right.
But the 3 mixes are different.
That's right. So across what you might call the Maya complexes that we work on, the peat, which is which should be sequestering carbon, looking at water, all that sort of thing. That's a Maya complex where you could argue that there are bogs and fens amongst that complex. And so we have tried to make our sphagnum plugs more specific to that. So the bog mix has more of the papillosum, capillosum, that sort of thing, the classic hummock builders. We have the what's called the moorland mix, arguably might be a fen mix in the gullies, with lots of things like phalax in there and palustri. And then we've got the pool mix for, as this picture shows, pools of standing water, which we are starting to get more and more of now behind our dams, where there's more cuspidatum and denticulatum, for example. And so we're trying to refine these mixes so that there are 2 things we really need. One is we want it to be survivable. They've got to survive. It's taxpayers' money, so we can't muck about with it. The other thing, we want to maximize the growth. So we want to have sphagnum plugs where the individual species are as close as possible to their optimum growing conditions. And the more we can learn about this, the more we can be sure in that one hit we get on each hill, we do a job that's good enough that lasts into the future for a long, long time. And we don't, in 5 years' time, go, oh, I wish I'd done it a different way.
So we're kind of refining those techniques as we go along,
We are.
and that should help improve, like you say, the kind of long-term quality of
Absolutely.
the work.
That's it. When we get on a hill, we normally have a short space of time to do our capital works before we come off again, because our projects are between 2, 3, maybe 5 years at the most. And so that's a short window in the life of a hill. And so we have a short period of time to maximize what we do on there before we know we have to leave. And so it is about, we do sweat the small stuff. Yeah, there's a great book by a Canadian astronaut called Chris Hadfield, An Astronaut's View of Earth. He says we do sweat the small stuff, and you have to. It's so important. Details count. And so, yeah, you could say I'm paid to be a pedant.
Love it. Yeah, me too sometimes, but in different ways. Brilliant. So we'll move on to another topic now that is extremely relevant at the moment.
Yep.
You're closely involved in both trying to prevent moorland wildfires and repairing the moors after a wildfire.
Yep.
So can you explain some of the specific issues involved in kind of repairing the moors after there's been a fire, and also preventing fires? And
Sure.
I think actually before we do that, we have our second quiz coming up.
Oh, yep.
So I think Alice is about to publish that for us. So if you could explain that quiz, that would be great, please.
Yep. So just checking my. So we have our wildfire database, which has been trying to collect the records of the wildfires that have happened, so we can learn more about them. And since 2007, we've got 383 records of wildfire in the South Pennine Special Area of Conservation. And my question is, how many of these are recorded as natural occurrences?
Okay, so we'll just wait for everyone to answer that question. I think people might be kind of changing their minds, as it's very even at the moment. So it looks like most people have answered.
Yep.
So we've got about 25% of people saying 1. Yep. We've got about 40% of people saying there are 2 described as natural.
Yep.
25% of people saying 7.
Yep.
And then 8% of people saying 15. So can you reveal the answer to that one?
The answer is 1. And I would even question that. That there's one lone record is reported as accidental in one report, natural in another, and it happened on a day when the temperature was 14 degrees and the relative humidity was 77%. So that is not a particularly likely day for a natural fire to occur, I would suggest, in those weather conditions. And so I have to cast some caution over that record. So I think and what that highlights is the importance of good data records, recording what happens to these fires, what started them, how do they behave. We don't understand them enough, and so we're not really able to respond to them and be proactive enough at the moment, it seems to me. If I could move on the slides here, this is a particularly important graph to me. So this shows you the water table on the Roaches estate, which is in Staffordshire, Southwest Peak, and it shows you how, if you can see that clearly, everybody, it shows you how on the left of the graph, the variation in the water table was quite moderate, with a dip in the summertime, as you expect, and then it returns to a relatively stable state until the winter of 2018, that drought. As you can see, that was a catastrophic drought for that moor. The water table plummeted, and it never stabilized thereafter. It has maintained that much more variable, flashy behavior ever since that fire, primarily, I think, because it hasn't got the vegetation anymore that has actually a controlling impact on the water. And we have similar graphs from places like Marsden and Chatsworth. So we suspect that this is something that's happening across our moorlands, certainly as a consequence of drought, and that drought is looking to be a increasing risk with climate change. And so
that the red line is the occurrence of the fire.
The event when the fire happened on the Roaches, yes.
Okay.
So what that shows is the underlying situation where our climate does appear to be changing and behaving in different ways. These droughts are a fundamental risk to these moors. We can see the impact it has, that they're supposed to hold water for us and supply us with our cleaning water, our drinking water, and hold it back to stop floods. But when you can see that flashy response after that fire because the vegetation has gone, their capacity to do that is completely destroyed. And so this is happening across our landscapes. We also
So it's a very pressing issue.
We also on that same site we've done our report into the carbon loss following that fire. It's showing 11,000 tons of carbon dioxide has been lost, or 4,000 tons of carbon. 5 centimeters, up to 10 centimeters in peat on that site have gone in some places. And given that peat is supposed to grow at about 1 millimeter a year when it's healthy, that suggests you're talking hundreds of years of really healthy peat growth gone in a year. And we're seeing that across the place. So if I could show you these other sites, so this is winter the roaches. So you can see 60 hectares burnt, and that was a small fire. For the next one, this is Marsden 2019, 705 hectares. Or if you look on that, Staley Bridge, over 1,000 hectares, and look at the cracking in that peat. That is a deep burn there that has burnt away a lot of carbon. Then look at this. This is Winter Hill. And I've been on the roaches and Winter Hill myself in the past couple of weeks, and there are parts of them which are still bare and still black. They are still dead, following those fires. They are not functioning, and without restoration, there's no capacity for them to become the blanket bog they once were.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to just stop you there because we've got 2 downloads that will have popped up for people. So one was the work that our colleague Paul did on estimating the amount of carbon released from a wildfire, and we were able to do that because there was already a monitoring site there, so we knew the depth of the peat beforehand, so we could measure the amount of peat lost. And we've also got the what's the other hand? Hang on, sorry, we've got another handout for people to have a look at, but I'm going to move you on because we're running out of time. I think everyone watching this will be fully behind us on the need to prevent wildfires. So the quiz showed that basically natural wildfires don't really happen. So it's all about people starting wildfires that we need to tackle. I think I'd really like to focus on what we do after a fire's happened to try and repair that site, if that's okay with you.
Of course,
yeah.
Well, I mean, there is hope. We can do something. So the image that's showing right now is work that was actually done by the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust on the roaches before the fire hit. It's some simple, small bunds. The same technique that we've used to make peat dams for decades, and bunds have been made in this country on lowland raised bogs since the 1980s. So it's an old technique, an old technology. But I don't quite know why we haven't been able to move it onto the blanket bog yet. But here it has worked. I think you can see the green, which has not burnt in that fire, and that was the only bit of that moor that didn't burn. I think re-wetting has enhanced its resilience to wildfire in that particular case. And so, building on that, I think that we are only at the beginning of our learning curve in this re-wetting work. We've been going for 20 years, which is not a long time. Back to the 80s, 40 years. Still not a long time compared to like the forestry, where you've got 1,000 years and thousands of years. Your foresters can look at a book and see their tables for which species, where you are in the country, what altitude you're at, and they will know how many tons of timber they'll produce in 5, 10, 20 years' time. That's done now. They've got that sorted. We are nowhere near that. And so we've got a long way to go. And so we can learn. So this picture of our bund trial we've just got on Close Moss. We have another one on the National Trust site of Holcombe and Stubbins. This is on the National Trust Marston Moor Estate. And we're trialing different types of bunds in different locations. We have the data from before they were installed. We have before data. We have controls in place to compare the impact of the bunds with no treatment, so you can see what's done. We have also on some of them planted sphagnum to see if these do actually affect the growth of sphagnum and enhance it. And so far, they're looking good. We have dip wells in place. We have vegetation quadrats in place. We have peat anchors in place, and we have photo surveys in place. So we are collecting data, and I hope by the end of the year, if we're lucky, we'll have some nice graphs that are proper science to show what these do. But at the moment, the soft evidence, if you like, is looking very good. They do appear to be holding water for longer than the surrounding ground and the controls. So that's my view. I've never seen it, but we've got to try. We have to push with whether with these sphagnum trials or putting pipes through dams to try to increase their NFM capacity. There are all sorts of ways.
NFM. What's that?
Sorry,
It's all right.
natural flood management. So using the wider natural environment across the board to hold more water, so it's slowed down by the landscape, and then it reaches the pinch points, the bridges, the towns, the cities more slowly, and so that mass of water flowing down the hill does so in a more gentle, even fashion.
In a more controlled way.
Yeah.
Okay, so Chris, that was a whistle-stop tour with loads of fascinating detail. I feel like it's pretty much time to go to questions now, if that's okay with you.
Quite what I mean? Yeah, sure.
Did you want to reinforce that point that you've got on that last slide?
I was just saying, simple thing, what we're aiming for is a carpet of living sphagnum along the peatlands that we work on at Moors for the Future. The ambition really is to get a carpet of living sphagnum. It's sphagnum that we made that peat where we see no sphagnum on top. There's not this disconnect we have to try to fix.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions. So if you'd like to add any questions, then please do. And the first one comes from Catherine. How quickly would they start storing carbon again after a wildfire?
The moors, it depends. Yeah. Well, I think as soon as vegetation starts to grow, that starts to lock up carbon. I think that's one thing. So any vegetation growing is lock up carbon as it does so. So once you get beyond that black charred state, you are starting to lock up carbon. But if that vegetation then rots away, then that's only a temporary storage of carbon. Whereas
a cycle. Yeah.
Whereas the likes of sphagnum moss and some of the sedges and things that make peat, they don't rot away. That's the whole point. They are stored in a dead but unrotted state or a slowly rotting state, so that their carbon is not released. And so with a lot of our wildfire sites, a critical trajectory, I would say, where that because of various issues, they are not wet enough. And so the vegetation, without assistance, is going to go towards a dry direction, which will give that temporary cyclical storage of carbon, but not long-term deep storage. And so what we're trying to do is to get the wetting in place, so we have sufficiently wet anaerobic conditions, which actually give us that long-term carbon storage. And that does take a long time. As I understand it, when you have within a peat mass, you have the water table, the level at which the water is saturated. So in a bog, the water table is high. If you put your finger in theory, you'll quickly find it saturated with water because the water's very high up there. When they burn, the water table drop, they dry out, and bringing that water table back up again takes a long time. I'm not sure there is evidence of severely damaged bogs actually being what you might call fully restored, where that water table comes back to the surface with a carpet of sphagnum. I don't know we've actually seen that anywhere at all. I think the estimates at the moment knock it on beyond 100 years to actually get that full restoration. But we can make steps and we can make progress. We can, for example, we can revegetate. We can definitely revegetate. We can adjust the hydrology, so we can block up the grips and the drainage and the gullies, for example. We can, where there aren't those features, we can do bunding, for example, to hold on to water. There are all sorts of things that we can kind of to kickstart it. And it's a great question, but the answer is we don't know yet. Because I said we're at the beginning of this industry to a degree, we don't know how fast we can go. We haven't found all the right answers yet.
I suppose the other thing to say is in a very degraded state where you've got the bare peat, they're losing carbon all the time. So if we can stop it losing carbon, that's a huge win already.
It is.
And then to start sequestering carbon eventually.
In our work, there are definitely two stages to restoration. One is preventing the loss, and the other is actually getting that carbon capture. And they're different. That's a critical point we try to get across. When you regreen the bare peat, you do stop a lot of the loss. Yeah. You do not start that carbon storage properly until you've got a really wet anaerobic environment in which the dead plants don't rot away. It seems to me. And so there are two distinct stages, and we can get to revegetation stably within 2 to 3 years of a fire, we've seen it on a lot of sites where we can do the brash lime fertilizer, for example, especially in tangent with the rewetting works. That's also critical. We can get things back on a green peg quite quickly, 2 to 3 years,
Fairly
quite
quickly. Yeah.
stably. But to actually then move it on to the carbon sequestering, going back to it, maybe even a blanket bog, that's a much bigger hit. We haven't really got that one sorted yet, but we can move in the right direction. I think things like the bund trial and the improvements in sphagnum planting, they're all going to make a huge difference in that.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple more questions here that are linked, so I'm going to link them together. Catherine asks, could you define what a bund/bunding is, please? And then we have a different Catherine asking, are there any studies on the efficacy of bunds? Is that the right word? How do you say that word?
Definitely.
How effective they are.
Well, okay, here's a picture of our bund trial. So what is a bund? I would say one of the reasons why I did this trial was because I was having conversations with stakeholders, and if I said the word bund, people all have a different image in their mind of what a bund is. And because we haven't done bunds on blanket form much before, I think no one can have a set perception of what a bund is that happened before. And so part of this is saying that is what I call a bund. They are low, they are about 20 centimeters high, maybe 30. They are varying in length. The ones in the trial vary. The contour ones are up to 60 meters long, whereas it's about 20 meters for some of the scalloped ones. But they can be any size. A bund can be 2 meters across, 1 meter across. It depends upon the landscape, and it depends upon the stakeholders as to what they're trying to achieve and what the landscape can sustain. But basically, if you think of a peat dam, which is where you've got excavating, clearing away what you might call the surface vegetation to one side, excavating to consolidated peat, and building almost like sandbags stacked together of consolidated blocks of peat, so that the seal between each one is squished down and there's no air in there at all. So you've got a nice firm construction. That is what's made there. So that where the water is in that picture, that is where the peat was taken from to make that slightly raised feature. The water's not deep. As you can see there, the vegetation that was is still starting to poke through, so the pools are at the most 40 centimeters deep on that particular site. But I think what a bund is dependent on what the stakeholders need and want and what the landscape can sustain. I think it's a great question, but actually for the future, we shouldn't say what a bund is until we see the site. Bunding is a technique.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. But I think another distinction that you've made in the past to me was that whereas a dam would block a gully, a bund would be on the higher, flatter ground, but with the aim still of trapping water behind it.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great challenges we have is rewetting the moors, because we know that when we put in peat dams, for example, the research suggests that it only rewets to within maybe 6-10 meters of that gully feature, for example, or that sort of ballpark. And a lot of our moors do not have gullies or grips intersecting them at regular intervals. I mean, we can reach all the more. And so we are looking for ways to re-wet those further to reach more.
The bits in between the gullies.
That's right. And so, as you just said, whereas the peat dams that we use fill in the eroded peat missing from channels are now being super highways for water. A peat dam is doing that. A bund, by contrast, I would say, raises higher than the surrounding ground, only a bit, but just enough to slow the passing water. And bunds are not about 1 or 2 installations. It's not about big things that look ugly. These things, when you approach the site, you can't see them.
Yeah.
That picture was taken when they were just installed. Now the vegetation has grown. You can't see them when you go there. This is about having thousands of tiny installations across the landscape that fit in.
Okay.
If you see what I mean.
And then the linked question was, are there any studies on how effective they are? So this will be a study, but we haven't got the data yet.
This work happened in March of this year, both here and on Holcombe and Stubbins. We have 2 trials, but both recording in a similar way the impact of a variety of designs of bunding. And so again, one of the reasons for me doing this was because I wasn't aware of someone doing it before, and I didn't know why. It seems to me not rocket science. It works so well under lowland maize bogs. When I saw it in 5 years ago on the Bog Life project, and they're doing a really good job on the lowland maize bogs, bunding and making cellular patterns to hold in water and encourage sphagnum. I didn't understand why that hasn't been translated onto the blanket bog, and so here we are.
Yeah, lovely.
And so we're getting that data from this so that we can share it, and then there can be an informed decision about, is this a good technique for these sites? Can we twist it, manipulate it, work it around a bit so that it fits this site, that site, this outcome, that outcome?
Great, thank you. So we're running over time a bit, but there are a couple more interesting questions. So if I can keep you for 5 minutes longer, is that okay?
Fine with
me. Another question here from Eleanor: is there any difference between bunding and cell bunding?
I think
that you know of.
Not really. I think this is such an emerging technology that each team, each group who do it are going to probably come up with their own bunch of words to describe what they're doing, and at some point we'll probably have to homogenize the whole lot so you know what we're talking about. So this is going to be an emerging. What is a bund, for example? I've tried to make a distinction. It's a raised feature above the surface rather than filling in a missed gap from a flow feature, basically. But yeah, in terms of what different types of bund is yet to be really determined, because we've done some, but I hope other people will look at our work and do something better afterwards.
Yeah,
that's the point of our work. It's not the thing, it's the thing that starts something else that's better. And so I'm hoping that people will look at ours and say, I could twist that, or that'll fit on my side if I do it a bit differently. And I'd love to hear about that. So I'm reluctant to say
what they are at the moment.
Yeah, because I want to know what these can do. I want to know what these could be, if you see what I mean. So yeah, because the question, maybe if you're talking about bund or a cell bund, we have what we're calling, and I think YPP have called, fish scale bunds, where they are smiley faces but they touch each other. So there's no way for the water to flow down that hill in between bunds. And maybe that when you've got cell bunding, that is probably what you mean, because they are creating isolated cells of water, almost small pools, tiny lagoons. Whereas the isolated bunds are little smiles on the landscape, if you like, that just collect a little half-moon crescent of water. So that might be what you call an isolated bund. But I'm reluctant to get pedantic about terminology at the moment, because I just don't know, and I don't think anyone will yet.
Okay, great, thank you. So I've got one more question that I'd like to put to you, which is, does the bare peat burn during a wildfire?
Yes. Peat is basically, as far as I can tell, it's dead vegetation, matter, and water. When it's really, really good, it's mostly water with something like the sort of the solidity properties akin to milk. Is ridiculously wet. But the critical problem of our peat is it's drying out. Bare peat is just too dry to function as a bog anymore, and so what you're left with is the dry peat. And so one of the big questions in wildfire management is about the fuel, managing the fuel load, and not only is it about managing it so you take it down if it gets too tall, but also stopping it getting too tall in the first place. And re-wetting can do that. So I've heard from some people that the growth rate of heather, for example, compared between the South Peak or the Dark Peak and Scotland, for example, is 7 times different because of the weather and the wetness. So if we can re-wet that peat and vegetate it, that is as I see, our primary line of defense on the moors, is to make them too wet to burn much. Everything will burn eventually if you get hot enough, but we can delay the point at which it burns. We can make them much less likely to burn.
Great. Okay, so I think we should end the questions there. I'd like to just highlight those couple of handouts. So we've handed out they're links to our website. So there's our wildfire database report, which is the one that I couldn't remember which one we shared. So that's all about the wildfires that we've been recording, and we continue to do that so that we can understand patterns around wildfires so that we can try to prevent them. And then there's also the Roaches report, which is the specific impacts of how much carbon was lost during that fire. So I'm just going to sum up quickly now. So thank you very much to everyone for listening, and thank you for getting involved as well. It's been really lovely to hear your thoughts and to chat to Chris, and thank you for those interesting questions as well. And thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
This is the last in our current series of regular webcasts. We've really enjoyed producing them, and we hope you have too. And our next webcast, we're going to plan for Bog Day, which is on Sunday, the 26th of June. So watch out on social media for that. To watch our previous webcasts, head over to our virtual Bogtastic experience page and watch out on social media for more. So you can see all our webcasts on that page, which has just been shared with you there. So thanks again to Chris, and thank you everyone for watching, and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
See you.